Lord Jesus, give us good thinking by your omnipotent power. Amen. We're in chapter 21, the zenith of the idolatrous power of the popes with their big egos in Rome, in Earle Cairnes' book, Christianity Through the Centuries. We have to read about this papal arrogance between 1054 and 1305. Hildebrand was able to humble the emperor of the empire, Innocent III, powerful enough to force rulers of rising nation states to do his will. And the papacy dominated the early part of the Crusaders' wars. The rise of universities and scholasticism strengthened the intellectual foundations of papal power. Monastic reform added papal power by giving many zealous monks who were obedient servants. It's doubtful whether the papacy ever exercised such absolute power over all phases of human life as it did in medieval Europe. Gregory VII asserts papal power, the power behind the papal throne. The idolatrous, so I'm just going to say idolatrous with the word pope or papal because it's the same. The idolatrous pontificates of Gregory VII and Innocent III easily dominated the history of medieval papacy. Both men were unwilling to accept the idea, that God had given the Pope and the temporal ruler coordinate sovereignty over the souls and bodies of men. Just would not accept that. The Pope would not accept the idea that he derived his control over men's soul from the temporal ruler, which would be the Erastian position. And the ruler would not willingly consent to the idea that he expressed sovereignty over men's bodies. No subsequent pope has ever been able to enforce his last claim as successfully as these two idolaters did. Hildebrand, 1020 to 1085, now buried and dead and rotten in some grave somewhere, ever in our minds of the continual apostasy of the church, laid these foundations upon which Innocent was able at a later date to make claims to superseding and supreme petrine authority. Hildebrand's career readily divides itself into two periods. He was first behind papal power throne for over 20 years before he became the idolatrous pope in 1073. And from 1073 until his death in 1085, he exercised powers that he had obtained for the popes when he was a humble supporter of the papacy. Give me a break. Cross that out. He was able to influence the formulation of papal policy under 5 popes until he finally became pope. This small, ungainly man with a weak voice, who was probably the son of a carpenter, had all the zeal of the best of the reformers of the Cluniac monasteries, with whose program of reform he sympathized. He also opposed simony, clerical marriage, and lay investiture. Leo IX gave Hildebrand his chance to become the power behind the papal throne by his selection of him and other good men from outside Rome to fill important positions in the papal curia. About the beginning of the 4th century, certain churches in Rome were exclusive sites for baptisms. Pastors of these churches became known as cardinals. The divisions of Rome into districts for the works of charity had been made earlier, and the priests of these were called cardinal deacons. By the 9th century, bishops near Rome were known as cardinal bishops. These men were the nucleus of what became the College of Cardinals. Hildebrand was placed in charge of finances for the Roman see, and became a cardinal archdeacon. Hildebrand exercised still greater power during the rule of Nicholas II, 1058 to 1061. They've already excommunicated the Greeks here in all their gentility and Christian apostolic love. When he was able to have ecclesiastical legislation that took the power of electing the Pope out of the hands of the populace of the Roman bishopric. The popular voice, it had been that which elected the popes from the earliest time. Although the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire often interfered in elections, and in the days of Hildebrand, the aristocracy of Rome had come to exercise corrupt control over the elections. At the Lateran Council of 1059, Nicholas, advised by Hildebrand, had the method of electing popes changed so that lay aristocratic and imperial influence might be eliminated. When a pope died, the cardinal bishops would meet to consider his successor. They would then consult the cardinal priest and cardinal deacons. They would then often only then were the people of the Roman bishopric permitted to vote on the nominee of cardinals. For all practical purposes, this put the election of the Pope under the control of the cardinals. A clergyman from anywhere in the Roman Catholic Church might be selected as Pope, and in case of unrest, the election might be held outside Rome. The new pope was able to take office immediately after his election. This change in the electoral procedure placed the choice of pope within the power of the clergy and eliminated lay control. So we've got power politics going on again. And we learn here what the human condition is often like, including what we see among the idolaters in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Always looking for power, always looking for the emotional payback of being a little idolater. So also in the church. The significance of this legislation for the rise of papal power must not be overlooked. Pope Gregory VII. Hildebrand was named and unanimously elected Pope Gregory VII in 1073 as a result of the people shouting, "Let Hildebrand be bishop." He was now in a position to work directly for his ideal of a theocracy. This reminds us of the theonomists and the theocrats who arose 25 years ago. But all being little imperialists themselves, they turned on each other and ate each other up. A theocracy in which both temporal and spiritual power could be exercised by the Pope as the vice-regent of God. He wanted no civil power to dominate the Roman Church. Instead, the Church was to control the civil power. For this reason, he dedicated himself to the abolition of lay investiture, the practice by which clerical leaders received the symbols of office from their feudal lord, which was usually a layman. He was also interested in the abolition of simony and the enforcement of clerical celibacy. Clerical celibacy really gets its big endorsement and imprimatur in this man's rule, which led to such disasters subsequently and hypocrisies, which Dr. Thomas Cranmer had to follow for a while. The ideal of idolatrous papal supremacy within the Roman Church and over temporal rulers is clearly developed in the Dictatus Papae, a document that was found among the letters of Hildebrand after his death. Even Cardinal Bishops, who is often credited with its authorship, wrote it. The document clearly expresses Gregory's ideal for the papacy. It made the most sweeping claims for papal supremacy, thus that have ever been noticed. It averred that the Roman Church owed its foundation to God alone. Well, that is hardly novel. That's rather New Testament-like. But you don't find anywhere in the New Testament where any of the apostles sought to exercise imperial, national, provincial, temporal sovereignty. But here we go. That the Pontiff alone is to be called universal, that he had full power over all bishops, that only his feet should be kissed by all princes, that he could depose emperors and might absolve subjects of evil from their allegiance. We see some of this monarchical impulses among some of the bishops in the Anglican side of things. Some of them really get off on this stuff. Can't be happy with a quiet and content, godly and humble life. You got to be seen and heard. The peak of papal pretension to supremacy was reached in the 22nd article of the Dictatus Papae, with the statement that there had never been an error in the Roman Church, and that according to the Bible, it would never err. Gregory was fully prepared to enforce these claims to be temporal as well as spiritual idol. He asserted that the countries of England, Hungary, Russia, Spain, and others had been put under the control of St. Peter and his successors. While Gregory warred successfully against clerical marriages and simony, the claims of the Dictatus indicated that the greatest problem would be to bring temporal rulers under his control. The major struggle of his pontificate, the struggle over lay investiture, was a heritage from his predecessor, Alexander II. The important archbishopric of Milan was vacant, and the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Henry IV, selected a man named Godfrey to fill the office. The electoral body of the archbishopric, however, chose a man named Otto. Alexander II recognized Otto just before he died. He excommunicated Godfrey. His successor, Hildebrand, gladly took up the struggle with Henry. In 1075, a Lateran synod forbade any high churchman to receive investiture to a church office from a layman. Henry was also ready for the struggle with the spiritual power of the papacy, but he had not been schooled to discipline himself. This flaw led him to take unwise courses of action in the struggle with the Pope, and he soon faced the rebellious feudal lords of Saxony, who resented his attempts to create a centralized state in Germany. After making a temporal peace with the Saxon nobles, Henry, five of whose counselors had been excommunicated by Gregory for simony, called a council in January 1076 at Worms. The council rejected papal authority. Gregory met this bitter denunciation and rejection of his authority by deposing Henry and releasing all his subjects from allegiance to him. This was a bold step, as any pope had ever taken in a dispute with a temporal power. But Henry's weakness at home gave Gregory his hope of success. In the fall of 1076, Henry's Saxon and other enemies declared that if he did not get release from Gregory's sentence of excommunication against him, they would depose him. They also invited Gregory to a synod that was to meet at Augsburg that winter. Faced with the danger of losing his throne and humiliation within his own realm, if Gregory came to Augsburg, Henry capitulated and with his wife and baby son crossed the Alps in the winter of 1077 to meet Greg at Canossa. It was a difficult journey. When Henry reached Canossa, Gregory let him stand barefoot in the snow outside the gates of the palace on 3 successive days before he would admit him to his presence. He then released him from his sentence of excommunication. So apostolic and so loving, so kind and humble was this great idolatrous Pope, big on his own ego. Though the greatest ruler in Christendom had been thus humiliated by the Pope, Henry gained much by his submission, for he kept Gregory from coming to a meeting at Augsburg and had defeated his German foes. The struggle continued throughout the remainder of Gregory's pontificate. Gregory later excommunicated and deposed Henry a second time, but with Germany supporting him, Henry invaded Italy and selected Wibert as Pope. After Henry was crowned by Wibert, he left Italy. Gregory then asked the Normans of southern Italy to help him. They did, but pillaged around Rome, and Gregory was forced to flee to Salerno. There, this great pope died in exile because, according to him, he loved righteousness and hated iniquity. The warfare over lay investiture continued until a compromise agreement was made in the Concordat of Worms between Emperor Henry V and Pope Calixtus II in 1122. The ring and staff, symbols of spiritual power, were to be given to church officials by the Pope or his agent, and the church official was to take the oath of loyalty to the temporal power. The Roman Catholic Church had the better of the king in spite of the compromise reached, because it had at least asserted equality with the state and had freed itself of imperial control in Italy. In addition, by his enforcement of clerical celibacy, after the ban on clerical marriage in 1074, Gregory had prevented the clergy from degenerating into a hereditary caste and had created a class of men loyal to their spiritual superior, the Pope. So the shift was away from the feudal layman, the loyalties there, the loyalties to the idolater of Rome. That's really what the whole purpose was. It was a power move. Though he died in exile, Gregory had done his work, and later popes built upon his foundation. Papal supremacy until under Innocent III. Elected as Pope in 1198, Innocent III, 1161 to 1216, lived 55 years, I guess, brought the medieval papacy to its zenith. He was the son of a Roman noble and given a fine education in theology at Paris and law at Bologna. His personal humility and piety were balanced by vigor, common sense, and a strong sense of the moral force that the papacy had. Innocent was a strong believer in the right of the Pope to supreme authority on earth. He believed that kings and princes derived their authority from him, and that he could therefore excommunicate, depose, or lay the interdict on them, which forbade the clergy to perform any but the most essential services of the church upon their state. He believed that God had given the successor of St. Peter the task of ruling the whole world as well as the church. The Pope stood above man and below God. So the Tudor kings and also the little idols in the Democrat Party have learned their pontification abilities from their Lord, the Pope. They don't know it, but it's all ego idolatry, power loving. The state should be related to the church as the moon is to the sun, and that's a good analogy. The church and the high pope is the sun, and then you got the little tiny moon, which is, say, the nation of England. The little moon is the nation of Germany. It's a very, very good metaphor that's worth noticing. The moon only shines by the reflection of the sunlight of the sun. The state could bask in that sunlight, but it was the glory of the papacy. And that's where it derived its power from. It is little wonder that with this view of the authority and power prestige of the papacy, Innocent was able to bring rulers, as well as those nation states of England and France, under his control, and defeat the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The position of the papacy had been further strengthened by the authoritative edition of canon law of the Roman Church in an edition 1148 by Gratian, a teacher monk at Bologna. And it's my understanding that they brought over the canon law of Rome into the church, Roman law, which exalted the emperor cult of the Roman kingdom. So it very much favored this idea of ego idolatry. The edition known as the Decretum provided a complete statement of canon law that could be used in the courts of the Roman Church. It must be remembered that Roman law, which was the foundation upon which canon law was built, supported the idea of centralization of authority in one single imperial individual. The Pope, of course, made full use of this to buttress himself. Now we look at the temporal versus spiritual rulers. Innocent III quickly took up the challenge of the rulers of the rising nation states of France and England, and that of the Holy Roman Empire after his accession to the chair of Peter. He used his power first against Philip Augustus of France in order that he might demonstrate that not even a king could flout his moral law concerning marriage. Philip had married Ingeborg of Denmark after the death of his first wife in 1193. When his bride came to France, he took a dislike to her and claimed that he had been bewitched. He forced the French bishops to annul the marriage and took Agnes de Meran into his home as his wife. Ingeborg appealed to the Pope for redress. Innocent thereupon ordered Philip to put away his wife Agnes. Sounds like a replay of Henry Tudor VIII, only 300 years earlier, and in France, to restore Ingeborg to her place as his lawful wife. When Philip refused, Innocent placed the entire country, the entire nation of France under the imperial edict, 1200. That meant that priests could not baptize babies in the entire nation. They could not conduct the sacrament for the people. They could not conduct funerals for an entire nation. That's what the Pope was doing. Irrespective, we put little old Philip Augustus to the side in his little marital adventures. The interdict affected everyone in the nation, closed all of the churches. Nobody could go to church in France. Now, they did allow for baptism of infants, but they forbade the giving of extreme unction to those who were dying. It forbade Holy Communion, except only to those who were sick and dying. And it forbade burial. The priest could only preach in the open air. The uproar that this caused across the entire nation of France forced King Philip to submit to the little Pope, big ego. And with bad grace, he sent Agnes away and brought Ingeborg back into his palace as his wife. Ingeborg's life was still not happy, but Innocent, by the use of spiritual weapons, had forced the ruler of one of the great nation states to obey him. Between 1205 and 1213, Innocent was able to defeat the brutal John of England in a contest over the election of an archbishop to the vacant archbishopric of Canterbury. Both the archbishop, elected by the clergy of the archbishopric, and the nominee forced upon them by John were set aside by Innocent when the question of his confirmation of the appointment arose. He appointed Stephen Langton instead. John refused to accept Langton. Innocent then excommunicated John and placed an interdict upon the entire nation of England in 1208. So if the Pope doesn't like the king, the whole nation is thrown into the pit. See how big the egos were? John was forced to humble himself because the English were opposed to him. And Philip of France, at the invitation of the Pope, was only too happy to have an excuse to invade England. Yeah, the Pope prompted the French nation to invade England as a military move by this so-called church leader. John acknowledged in 1213 that he held his kingdom, get this, as a feudal vassalage of the Pope, and he agreed to pay 1,000 marks annually to the Pope. This payment was not finally repudiated until the time of the English Reformation. Having successfully humiliated the rulers of two of the most important emerging nation states, Innocent III decided that it was time to deal with the problem of bigger fish to fry with the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1202, he asserted that the right of the Pope to approve or disapprove the emperor elected by the German electors of the empire. The Compromise of Worms had created what was an easy armistice between emperor and pope, and the Italian people were anxious to cooperate with the Pope to end imperial interference by the emperor in Italy. Henry VI, emperor between 1190 and 1197, had married a Norman princess named Constance. Though through his marriage, he laid claim to Sicily, as part of his dominion. This gave him control of lands from north and south of the Papal States. His son Frederick was made king of Sicily, and Innocent made him guardian after Constance's death. When Otto IV forgot the promises he'd made to Innocent at the time of his coronation, Innocent supported the claims of Frederick to the imperial throne and was able to secure his election to that office as Emperor Frederick II in 1212. Innocent then called the armies of Philip II of France and defeated Otto. And here we'll draw this to a close. Glory be to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen.